Welcome to this video on defining terms. I found that students have lost the ability to make their own definitions for terms. Consequently, students tend not to understand the definitions that have been given to them in class and in texts. Defining terms is a bit of an art. It is not merely a case of looking something up in the dictionary. Before we look at proper habits for creating definitions, let us look at what happens when definitions go wrong. One bad habit for giving a definition is simply providing a synonym. Synonyms are a fine start, but they cannot be the end of your process. To see why, look at this series of definitions. I looked up exist in the dictionary. The main definition was something like this: have objective reality or being. Well, it is a bad habit when providing a definition to use a term that is at least as obscure as the term being defined. In this case, the terms objective, reality, and being all need to be defined. In other words, if you don't know what exist means, then you won't understand what these terms mean. Well, I looked up objective next. Here's the definition for objective. The first part will not do me much good since it includes the word exist in it. That is another bad habit for defining terms, using the term to be defined in the definition. So I will have to rely on the second part of the definition. Again, I need to have actual defined. So I looked up actual. Great. Actual means existing in fact. Now we have the problem just mentioned with using the term to be defined in the definition. I am not going to bother looking up the word fact. Let's move on to reality. Reality is defined as the world or the state of things as they actually exist. Well, there is that same problem again. Maybe we'll have better luck with being. Great. Being is defined as existence. Here's what happens when you put all of this together. This is what happens when you use synonyms to define your term. And using the definitions for the term within the definition for exist is defined as having existing existence or existence. Well, that's not good. Another bad habit of creating definitions is to define the term by what it is not. Suppose we are defining the term dog. Suppose we define dog as is not a cat. Well, this does not do me much good. Lots of things are not cats. Dolphins, shoes, comets, and numbers are all not cats, but these are also not dogs. Don't get me wrong, there is something useful in describing something by what it is not. This can be helpful with clarifying a term. However, the definition should not stop with merely a description of what the thing is not. Another bad habit is to provide a definition by merely providing instances of the thing defined. This does not tell me what a dog is, merely that these things are dogs. Why, by looking at these instances, I might conclude that no long-haired thing is a dog, since none of these dogs have long hair. Again, providing instances might help someone better understand, but that should not be all there is to your definition. Sometimes I've seen people try to define something through a metaphorical use of the term. This is a huge mistake, primarily because you have to know the literal sense of something before you understand the metaphorical sense. In philosophy, it is best to keep metaphorical uses of a term to a minimum anyway. Here's another mistake: defining dog in terms of canine. This has two main problems. First, because canine is another term for dog. This is merely providing a synonym. A second main problem is that in biology, canine is used to refer to a variety of different animals, including wolves, dogs, and foxes. However, neither wolves nor foxes are dogs. There are differences. Let us look at how the word define is defined. This might help us clear up the idea a bit more. The first definition is to set forth the meaning. Well, since meaning is usually just a definition, this defines define as the act of defining. Brilliant. The next one might be more helpful. This definition could stand to have more than a few of its terms defined, but at least we are getting somewhere. Whether things have a nature and what they are is a tricky question that occupies a great deal of philosophy. I'm not going to go into the debates now, but this is worth keeping in mind. This next one comes dangerously close to including the term defined in the definition with the use of the term definitely. Let's move on to the next. Well, this is interesting. Taken literally, this is helpful only with spatial things. This will do us little good in providing a definition for the number 2 or the concept of justice. Let's look at the next one. Again, this definition is helpful only with spatial things or with visual things. Well, finally, let us look at the etymology of the term. The word define comes from words that mean to end or to limit. This, I think, is starting to provide a clue as to what defining a term should be. In order to develop proper habits in defining terms, we should say a few things about the purpose of providing a definition. The first purpose of providing a definition is simple communication. We all have a massive framework of beliefs and experiences, and not all these frameworks are completely alike from person to person. There are similarities, to be sure, but there is no one that has an identical set of beliefs and experiences to another person. Those similarities, however, enable us to communicate, to find the idea in someone else's mind. Sometimes a person has no conception of what you're talking about. However, most often you're able to start with a related idea and work your way to that conception in the other person's mind. The second purpose is to distinguish one thing from another. Things are different. This is what makes them things. You are not a tree. There are significant differences. There are similarities to be sure, but there are significant differences. To say the two things are the same merely because they have similarities is to mistake a person for a tree. The final purpose is to make the subject matter better understood. This is true for yourself and for your audience. By exploring more and more of what a thing is, how it is related to other things, and how it is different from other things, the more you will understand the thing that you're trying to define. You will likely find that you did not understand it as well as you thought. Here is one proposed definition for definition. Now, this has its uses since it gets at the idea that we're trying to distinguish one thing from another. It has its drawbacks too. For instance, if I wanted to define the term computer, and I wanted to include all of what is true about computers, I could include that a computer is sitting on my desk. However, this does not seem really useful. Still, keep this idea in mind. When we are providing a definition, we are trying to say what is true about that thing defined, and only what is true about the thing defined. Thus, while it is true of computers and lamps that they both sit on desks, it is only true of computers that one types with a computer. One does not type with a lamp. This is a similar approach to the last one. The idea here is that we are providing a description of the thing to be defined. This description includes what the thing is like and how it is different from what it is like. For example, computers and typewriters are similar. Thus, the description "is used to type with" can apply to both computers and typewriters. However, they are different since a typewriter will create documents by using letters or other characters pressed into a paper, most often with carbon or ink. A computer does not do this. This is, of course, not all there is to either computers or typewriters, but this is a start. When providing a definition of this sort, a proposition like the following is used quite often. The thing defined is given a name. The next part of the definition is a description of what it is like. The second part of the definition is a description of how it is different from what it is like. Quite often the first part is called a genus, and the second part is called a species. Here is an attempt at a definition for dog. It is not good enough, but it's a start. The description "four-legged land animal" is the part of the description that tells what it is like. There are, however, lots of things that are four-legged land mammals. Lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. To distinguish dogs from lions, tigers, and bears, we have the second part of the definition. Dogs are typically domesticated and bark. This is not perfect by any means, but it is a nice beginning towards illustrating a definition of this kind. Quite often in what's called analytic philosophy, philosophers attempt to provide definitions in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. If you do not know what necessary and sufficient mean, you should watch the video on truth relations provided earlier. As an example of a definition using necessary and sufficient conditions, we have square. A square is often defined in terms of conditions 1 through 3. These conditions are jointly necessary and sufficient for a square. If you're missing either one, the conjunction is either not sufficient or it's not necessary. When writing in philosophy, or in any field actually, it is helpful to use the following guides in defining a term, or as it is sometimes called, explaining a term. First, while providing synonyms should not be the only thing you do, you can introduce the topic by providing synonyms. Next, it is helpful to contrast the term with what it is not. Contraries or contradictories can be helpful in this regard. Sometimes people think in terms of opposites. Thus, while defining dog by "not a cat" is not a good definition, it might be helpful to introduce the idea as a pet that it's not a cat. You should provide a definition in one of the 3 ways provided above. Either by saying what is true and only true of that thing, or by a description of what it is like and what it is not like, or by in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. This does the main work. This definition will be used to determine whether the conclusions you have drawn are good conclusions. Always, always, always provide examples. Examples help clear confusions, and there will be confusions. Sometimes providing examples is all you can do. For example, you probably cannot define the color blue to someone who has never seen it. I, for example, am slightly colorblind. I see colors, just not as many as you do. There are shades of red, green, orange, and brown that I simply don't understand, and I never will. It does not do any good to give me the definition in terms of the wavelengths of light. That does not produce the color in my mind. It does not do any good to tell me where it fits in the color wheel. I created paintings for a number of years. I understand the color wheel quite well, but that does not produce the color in my mind. Sometimes the only way to define something is to point at it. This is called an ostensive definition. My advice, if you're going to provide an ostensive definition, make sure you explain why you can't define it any other way. Finally, always explain how the term is different from things that can be easily confused with it. This is an art, meaning it sometimes takes experience and talent to figure it out. But we all have at least a small measure of this talent. Usually this is enough. Further, the more practice you get at this, the better you will be at it. In addition to what you should do, here's a list of things to avoid. Don't provide a negative definition. That is, don't define something in terms of what it isn't. Provide synonyms, but not just synonyms. Provide instances, just not only instances. Do not provide metaphorical uses. This does not help further understand the term. Do not use the term defined in the definition. The next mistake might be difficult to understand. You have to make sure your definition does not include things that should not be there. For instance, if I merely define dogs as four-legged land animals, this definition includes lions, tigers, and bears. You must provide a definition that includes only the instances of the thing defined. What follows this is to provide a definition that does not exclude instances of the thing defined. For example, suppose I define a moral action as that which is courageous. Well, there are lots of moral acts that have little to do with courage and yet are moral, such as giving a hot meal to someone who is hungry. This need not be an act that requires courage, and yet it is still moral. Finally, avoid obfuscation. Clear enough? No? Well, that's probably because I used an overly complicated word when I didn't need one. Obfuscate means to make something unclear or obscure. When defining a term, never use a term that is more complicated than the one you are defining. Never, never, never try to show off using a quote-unquote big word. It is just annoying. I'm not trying to criticize using unusual words. It can be quite fun. However, don't do so when you're trying to be clear. Well, that wraps it up for defining. A good practice is writing around 100 to 300 words using the tips I provided to define critical terms. You'll be surprised how easy it is to fill 300 words with these tips, and this makes for good papers.